El día de mañana, Argentina realizará las elecciones legislativas.
Tomorrow, Argentina will hold its midterm legislative elections. In addition to determining the composition of both chambers of Congress, the elections will decide, above all, the political fate of President Javier Milei and his government, cornered by the economic crisis and also by corruption scandals. Polls predict a clear defeat for the ruling party, but we make an even bolder prediction. Tomorrow's elections will mark the end of the Milei project and could even trigger a crisis and the fall of his government. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning from Buenos Aires, Argentina. We begin broadcast number 276 of Demolishing Myths Live.
Demoliendo mitos en vivo. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos y recuerden, por favor.
Thank you very much for joining us, and please remember to help us with a thumbs up against censorship. In this broadcast, we're going to focus on Argentina, because we'll be analyzing the Argentine political and economic situation from a geopolitical perspective. Lately, we haven't been doing national analyses, but rather regional or even global ones on our channel. However, due to tomorrow's midterm elections, and my current visit to my beloved city of Buenos Aires and my beloved country, Argentina, today once again we're going to focus on a specific country, in this case the Argentine Republic, but from a geopolitical perspective, of course.
Argentina, pero desde una perspectiva geopolítica, eso sí. Comencemos entonces con un análisis de la situación.
Let's begin then with an analysis of the general situation, the context, moving from the broadest to the most specific. The world is undergoing a fundamental, structural, systemic, and decisive transition. On one hand, we can interpret it from a closer perspective and say that we are witnessing the shift from a unipolar order to a multipolar one. Logically, a unipolar order led by the United States, and the transition, in this case, is moving toward a multipolar order led by China, Russia, India, Brazil, South Africa, and naturally also by the United States, though now with many more countries on the international stage. However, if we analyze this transition from a slightly broader, more distant perspective, we could then establish, as many analysts do, that it is no longer simply a shift from the unipolarity that began after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, and the beginning of US unipolarity. No, not just that, but we could even say that at present we are witnessing a transition from the US hegemonic order established since the end of World War II. This is the political and economic order that began after the transition period between the First and Second World Wars, with the crisis of the 1930s in between, from which the British Empire, which before this transition had been the main power, the greatest power, the world's hegemon, recedes, withdraws from the center, and in its place, the United States emerges from 1945 onward. Naturally, the Soviet Union will also accompany it in the following years, but the global structure will be determined by the United States. And thus, for example, the UN, the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and all the Western institutions based on US hegemony will appear at that time. So a transition in the world seen up close, from the unipolar to the multipolar, from a unipolar order to a multipolar one. Seen from a bit more distance, it's a transition from US hegemony, which began after World War II, toward a new, contested hegemony. And we can even, if we want to characterize this transitional period from a broader perspective, also conceptualize it as the end of Western hegemony, not just that of the United States, but of the West over the world. And of course, in that case, we must go much further back in time, because what comes into question is not only US hegemony after World War II, but the cultural and civilizational hegemony of the entire West, which means we could go back at least 500 years or so to the arrival of Europeans in the Americas. And some analysts, a bit bolder, go even further and interpret this as the end of the civilizational hegemony of the West, which would have begun around 2,000 years ago, right? Well, roughly during the period of the Roman Empire, in the time of Jesus Christ, right? About 2,000, actually a little more than 2,000 years of Western history, of Judeo-Christian history, of the hegemony of Western culture and civilization. 2,000 years that would be coming to an end right now. Perhaps we don't share such a radical view of the current transition. Those 2,000 years of history certainly don't just vanish. But we are indeed witnessing a shift from a Western hegemony that began roughly 500 years ago, centered in the West, first in Europe and later in North America, toward a new hegemony centered in Africa. This is the dimension of the transition in which we appear, and I'm starting from the broadest perspective. We're going to move forward, step by step, in our analysis toward tomorrow's elections with Milei. So relax. We're starting with a broad geopolitical analysis, but little by little we'll present more and more details about the current situation. Well, this transition, of course, is also accompanied, logically, by an economic transition, a shift from one economic system to another. All within the framework of capitalism, yes, but of different variations of capitalism. And so we are witnessing at this moment a transition from the global capitalism led by the United States. Some theorists call this the American cycle of accumulation, which followed the British cycle of accumulation under the British Empire, up until once again the interwar period and the end of World War II. Just as before the British cycle of accumulation, there was the Dutch capitalist cycle, and before that, the Genoese one. That is the history of capitalism, with certain states serving as the heads of those economic and political systems. Well, in the present, we are also experiencing an economic transition, marked by the end of this capitalist cycle of accumulation led by the United States, characterized by a process of financialization. And here, by the way, I want to reference someone, make a small reference, because lately I've been very immersed in reading Arrighi, Giovanni Arrighi, an Italian theorist, an Italian economist, a world systems theorist, also connected to Immanuel Wallerstein, another theorist from this perspective, who determines that indeed there are more than 500 years of capitalist history. From this perspective, capitalism does not begin with the Industrial Revolution in the United Kingdom, but rather starts earlier, roughly in the long 16th century, and the Industrial Revolution in the United Kingdom actually represents a phase of that capitalism. Well, in that long history of capitalism, each phase is led by a hegemonic state. Once again, Genoa, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, the United States, and possibly China in its next phase. Each of these phases is characterized by a period of consolidation of that dominant political and hegemonic power, followed by crises, and finally, decline. And each of those declines is marked by a process of financialization. The fact is that, in the final years of a capitalist accumulation cycle of this kind, the hegemonic power abandons the form of industrial accumulation, the form of productive accumulation, to transform itself into a financialized economy. Something very similar to what happened with the old British Empire. From an industrial machine, remember the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, that in the last years of the 19th century and the early 20th turned into a merely financial center, the City of London, and nothing more. And we see something similar in the United States. At one point, an industrial machine with a booming economy, World War II, then the 1950s, 60s, even into the 70s, but starting in the 1980s, with neoliberalism, a period of financialization begins. And today, basically, who determines the fate of the US economy? as well as US politics, basically, Wall Street. This is the typical financialization period that marks the end of an accumulation cycle led by a state. Righi also goes further back and recalls, for example, that the Genoese capitalists, in fact, financed Columbus's voyage, providing funding to the Spanish crown for Columbus's later journey to the Americas, precisely during a period of financialization of that emerging Genoese bourgeoisie in the 16th and 17th centuries. So pay attention to this, it's super interesting. This process of financialization of the economy actually represents a symptom of the decline of the United States as a hegemonic power, both politically and economically. This, then, is the general situation of the global context, which is extremely important for the later analysis of each national case. In this context, the declining power, the United States, reacts by hardening its policy toward its sphere of influence, toward what they conceptualize as their backyard, that is, Latin America. And here Milei appears, right? We'll see in a moment how we're going to present him. But here Milei appears as a puppet, a subject, a servile state in the backyard of the United States in South America in a strategic geopolitical position. And once again, his appearance also responds to this crisis. Why? Because all these governments, like Milei's, Bolsonaro's, Trump's, or the potential governments of the new far-right movements in Europe and elsewhere in the world, also appear within the framework of this crisis as a false response to the three major consequences of this geopolitical and geoeconomic crisis, of this transition from unipolarity to multipolarity, of this transition toward the end of US hegemony and the beginning of a new hegemony, presumably. A transition from this US-driven capitalism, this neoliberal American system of accumulation in open crisis. That basically produces three major consequences on a global scale. On one hand, there's a tremendous concentration of wealth, super-rich, ultra-rich, and a galloping, ever-growing inequality, now comparable to Victorian times. On the other hand, this logically leads to a total and absolute hollowing out of democracy, a complete deterioration of democracy, and the spread of an era's mindset that all politicians are corrupt. Politicians don't represent me. And thirdly, from a cultural standpoint, this crisis brings about the spread of a culture of hyper-individualism, right? Everyone turned inward, each person in a save-yourself-if-you-can mode, and any possible collective construction, from a political party to a labor union, but also the family itself, the church. Everything naturally disappears into the self-referentiality of individualism. As the ultimate example of that, this garbage, a screen in front of our eyes, and the idea of our individuality as the center of the world and as the only possible way to relate to our surroundings, creating more and more distance from our own beings, with all the consequences that come with it. No, nothing more. Remember Plato's definition of the human being, of man in the sense of both male and female. Man represents a political animal, a social and political animal. Well, if man abandons his social and political dimension, then only the dimension of the animal, the beast, remains. And this is the widespread process. And in this context, all over the world, not just in Argentina, we Argentinians take pride in our belief in our own exceptionalism, and for us, Milei represents an exception. No. Milei appears as just another figure within a global phenomenon, one more of those characters who have emerged in the heat of this crisis, once again rooted in inequality, democratic decay, and hyper-individualism, responding to the crisis not by addressing its causes, but by creating scapegoats.
Sino estableciendo chivos expiatorios. Los mexicanos en el caso de Trump en Estados Unidos.
Mexicans in Trump's case in the United States, black people, indigenous people, and homosexuals in Bolsonaro's case, Muslims in the European cases, mostly, and so on. But in the Argentine case, something perhaps exceptional appears. The one who is portrayed as the villain. The one responsible for all these deeply rooted theoretical problems within the framework of such a large, long-lasting crisis. Well, basically, Milei presents the state as responsible for this. Populism, a very, very vague category. Populism as the cause of all these evils, and sometimes even the poor as responsible for poverty. Why is that? Why this particular construction of a scapegoat of these characteristics in Argentine society? Well, because to a large extent, Argentine society descends from the mixture of indigenous peoples, partly also from the slaves brought from the African continent, and from European migrants. And all that mix generated not only Argentina's ethnic composition, but also the cultural horizons of Argentines. So a very racist, very anti-foreigner, very anti-immigration, very anti-Muslim discourse would lack roots here. It wouldn't attract ordinary people. That's why Milei, who does he present as the villain in this whole story? The state and the poor, basically. This is perhaps Milei's exceptional trait.
Excepcional de Milei. Y curiosamente,
and curiously, and precisely because of this far-right movement, in Milei's case, does not present itself like Trump's, Bolsonaro's, Le Pen's, Germany's AfD, or Nigel Farage's in the United Kingdom. It does not include a nationalist component, rejecting the so-called globalists. In fact, they call globalism progressive neoliberalism, but they do not present that national component. Quite the opposite. Within a decaying order, instead of identifying that decaying order as the cause of the crisis, they carry out, on the contrary, a blind, radical, furious defense of that very same decaying order. So if society appears broken by neoliberalism, what is Milei's solution to all these problems? More neoliberalism. They call it anarcho-capitalism, but in reality, that's what they represent. A radical and totalitarian ultra-neoliberalism.
Ultraneoliberalismo radical y acelerado. Esas las características de Milei.
Those are Milei's characteristics, and that's the reason for his rise. Naturally also linked, without a doubt, to the terrible previous government, that of the Fernandez administration, as we remember Alberto Fernandez, a failed, corrupt government, and so on. That explanation may appear in electoral terms. As a social, political, and economic process, Milei actually responds to this entire set of causes just outlined. And that's how Milei begins as an ultra-neoliberal, a government based on the traditional neoliberal leaderships, only in an even more extreme form. What characteristics does neoliberalism present in the world, and in particular in Latin America and Argentina? What kinds of governments does it establish? Above all, deindustrializing and financializing governments begin a policy of total openness, economic openness in trade, economic openness in finance. This immediately leads to the destruction of industry and the rise of speculative finance. On the other hand, logically, as good neoliberals, they begin a process of dismantling the state, hoping that the market will emerge in its place as the natural replacement for the state. And so privatizations begin, and so do the disasters, such as the scandal in Argentina involving ANMAT, the state institution responsible for regulating medicines, so that products certified by the state are safe and properly controlled. Well, the destruction, the dismantling of the entire state, and even of this institution, led, for example, to the emergence of companies, one in particular, selling adulterated drugs. And this triggered the deaths of many people due to the lack of control over medications. Just one example of this destruction of the state, the market stepping in to take its place and creating, well, a disaster, right? Because the state must fulfill a regulatory role over the market. Otherwise, the market, driven by profit, can commit any atrocity just to generate more profit, because that's the logic of commerce. Moreover, Milei's government was characterized from the start by a cheap dollar policy. If he actually wanted to dollarize the Argentine economy, yet another sign of his civility. If he wanted to directly abandon the national currency and establish the dollar as legal tender. But since Argentina lacked dollars, lacked the backing for such a policy, and the United States did not endorse this madness, he instead implemented a cheap dollar policy, right? This was done in the hope of reducing inflation. If the dollar appeared relatively cheap and wages remained frozen despite inflation, that was supposed to bring inflation down.
Una baja de la inflación. Generó en efecto una pequeña baja de la inflación a costa, una vez más, de la destrucción.
It did in fact cause a small drop in inflation, at the cost once again of destroying the economy. 2 years of recession and counting, deindustrialization, unemployment, and, well, an economic collapse. But of course, in order to carry out a cheap dollar policy, it had to constantly generate debt. Otherwise, it couldn't set a low dollar price without having dollars available for anyone who wanted to buy them at that reduced rate. If it had to sell dollars, it had to put dollars on the market for anyone who wanted them at that very low price, guaranteed by the state. And this created tremendous national debt, added to the debt already inherited. Debt, incidentally, first incurred by Macri, but with the same Minister of Economy as Milei, Caputo.
Que Milei, con Caputo en aquel momento, por cierto, quien determinó la entrega de...
At that time, by the way, who decided on the allocation of dollars for that debt? Well, first, logically, the capital markets, the private sector. When the major investment banks themselves determined that Argentina would not be able to handle that enormous amount of financial debt, that huge sum of borrowed dollars, they began to pull out of the country, and Macri had to call the IMF in desperation. And the IMF responded, back then with Trump as president, in his first term. Yes, dear Mauricio, we're going to issue the largest international dollar loan in the history of the IMF and in the history of humanity. Of course, in violation of the IMF's own statutes. And with these dollars, you'll be able to, you too at the time, Mauricio Macri, will be able to create a cheap dollar policy and thus win re-election. Well, Macri couldn't manage even with the 50 billion, actually $55 billion promised by the IMF, of which only 45 billion were ultimately delivered. Because that's what led to this disaster. Macri's downfall, the arrival of a new government, and the abandonment of the last part of the loan. But on the basis of those $45 billion of debt, incidentally, with the International Monetary Fund, plus a pile of debt with capital markets, investment funds, and major global lenders, Milei once again began with a policy of borrowing and a cheap dollar. And this created the need for new debt, and more dollars to sustain something unsustainable, while simultaneously destroying the Argentine economy.
Destruyendo a la vez en paralelo la economía argentina. ¿Cómo generó la primera gran llegada de dólares a través?
How did he generate the first major influx of dollars? Through a money laundering policy. Basically, many people, or above all, Argentina's ruling classes, earn their profits in the country and then move those dollarized profits abroad. Well, he created an amnesty, a pardon for all those people, and called on them to at least repatriate part of that money here, in the new Argentina of equality and great opportunities, in reality, of big business and major corrupt deals. But that's how he generated the first inflow of dollars, around $25 billion at the time. Well, shortly after, that money disappeared, in this policy of financialization, financial speculation, and handing over dollars to the big economic groups that wanted cheap dollars once again to move their profits out of the country. Back then, I remember we predicted that the government should immediately carry out a devaluation because it wouldn't be able to sustain for long this exchange rate with such a cheap dollar and so much speculation around. Once again, the purchase of those cheap dollars and their flight abroad by the big economic groups. Well, but then the International Monetary Fund showed up once again, as always, under the orders of the United States. The current director, Georgieva, a Bulgarian, ultimately answers naturally to the US, And Trump then decided on another bailout, not directly from the pockets of Americans, but from the entire fund, with a new loan, in addition to the previously mentioned $55 billion with Caputo during Macri, now with the same Minister of Economy, Caputo, during Milei, another $20 billion. This was in April, just a few months ago.
De dólares. Esto en abril apenas, hace algunos meses. Todo esto además va generando una hipoteca del futuro, porque, claro.
All of this, moreover, is creating a mortgage on the future, because of course, future generations, and above all, the next governments will have to answer for this damned debt, once again received and paid, handed over again to the big groups and their capital flight abroad. Well, Macri then, Milei, after this last loan, just a few months later, once again found himself on the verge of default, with the Argentine economy in recession, on the brink of a new crisis. And before that collapse, just 2 weeks ago, he made a trip to the United States, desperate before the elections, seeking a new bailout. And Trump responded with the announcement of a new rescue, with a supposed currency swap, an exchange of currencies.
Un supuesto swap de monedas, un intercambio de monedas. Es una forma indirecta de endeudamiento. Bueno,
it's an indirect form of borrowing. Well, a country buys another country's currency to generate stability in the foreign exchange markets, and then those dollars used to buy pesos are available to one country for a while, until they're returned years later. That supposedly helps stabilize a currency. This so-called loan, so-called because it's actually also a lie, naturally comes with conditions. What are Trump's conditions? What does Trump want?
Lógicamente, ¿cuáles las condiciones de Trump? ¿Qué quiere Trump? Bueno, quiere los recursos naturales, quiere una base.
Well, it wants the natural resources. It wants a US base in Tierra del Fuego. But above all, in the context of this previously mentioned transition from a unipolar to a multipolar world, and of this crisis in the economy led by the United States, what does it want? It wants China out. So from the very beginning, it wants China out of its backyard, out of Latin America, and out of Argentina.
De América Latina y de Argentina. Entonces comenzaron desde el principio los estadounidenses.
So the Americans started from the beginning by saying, well, this loan, yes, with this loan, we're going to help Argentina. But for that to happen, all Chinese investments, and even previous loans from China, because China had already helped Argentina with loans, must leave Argentine national territory. Well, they had to correct themselves shortly after, because if indeed another currency swap, another indirect but earlier loan from China to Argentina, had to disappear today, then the Argentine economy would collapse immediately, which would make the US bailout completely pointless. They corrected themselves. But shortly afterward, as always, Trump, running his mouth, a chatterbox, a loudmouth, at a regrettable press conference, we showed it here alongside Milei, made an announcement conditioning all this aid not only on cutting ties with China, not only, well, not on the Chinese currency swap, but on ending Chinese investments, supposed Chinese military bases, or any economic or political cooperation between Argentina and China. In addition, he set a new condition. What was the condition stated at that press conference? Well, basically, Milei's electoral victory, when all the polls predicted the opposite. This once again caused chaos in Argentina. What do you mean this aid only comes if Milei wins? But Milei is going to lose. So in any case, the economy in default, in a declaration of non-payment of foreign debt, chaos, economic collapse. Well, after this last disaster a week ago, to top it off, a plane trip. Answering a question from a journalist close to Fox, and therefore close to conservative sectors, Trump replied as follows. He was asked, "Why do you help Argentina if helping Argentina harms US agricultural producers due to the natural competition between Argentine soybean producers and US soybean producers?" And Trump, very angry, replied, "You don't know what you're talking about. Argentina is fighting to survive. Argentina is almost dead." Explosion here.
Explosión aquí. Además, recuerden esto, por sobre todas las cosas, a los demoledores.
Also, remember this above all else, to the non-Argentine critics, both Latin American and Spanish. In Argentina, we are characterized by a predisposition toward what is foreign, first European and then American, an obsession with how Europeans and Americans see our country and ourselves. So that ends up being more important than the news from here or our own view of ourselves. What Trump says, what Merkel says, what Pedro Sanchez says, what Macron says.
Lo dicho por Pedro Sánchez, lo dicho por Macron. Bueno, esto es una cuestión de nuestra cultura, este eurocentrismo.
Well, this is a matter of our culture, this damned Eurocentrism, and this idea that Europe and the United States represent everything, that their vision determines everything, and that we must always appear as the best students. So all these statements by Trump caused a huge reaction here, much more than, for example, negative statements by Trump against Brazil would. For Brazilians, it's exactly the same. The nonsense said by that loudmouth Trump. Well, for Argentinians, and above all for the Argentine media, this comes across as a tragedy. In addition to this total economic crisis, Milei's government was also accompanied by a large number of corruption scandals. So not only this entire economic disaster, the handing over of natural resources, the possibility of military bases, the surrender of the economy, the surrender of sovereignty to the United States in exchange for nothing, the country's indebtedness, the privatizations, all that collapse, all that disaster, but also accompanied by a lot of corruption as a result of the human reality of the gang of thieves surrounding Milei. He himself, a total lowlife, right? A petty thief, not even a white-collar one, but simply a poor guy whose own parents didn't even want him, with psychological problems. Yet another issue, right? You'll all remember the images shown here of him at public events, having panic attacks, soiled himself, poor guy. Sometimes he even inspires pity. All those fantasies of his about contacting his dead dog in the afterlife through a medium. Well, on top of all that, a scoundrel, but a low-level one, part of a gang of petty thieves, these people. And well, that naturally led to the proliferation of one scandal after another. First, let's recall the biggest scandal at the beginning. The scandal over a cryptocurrency called Libra, created by one of those cryptocurrency gurus, those disgraceful figures, so idolized by Milei and his government. This man, a young guy who came to Argentina, launched a cryptocurrency with Milei's endorsement. Milei presented it, or promoted this new cryptocurrency, on his own website as president. This caused a very rapid increase in the price, and that's when the crafty ones made the sale. Immediately afterward, the price dropped sharply, and that generated millions in profits for a handful of clever operators through this naturally ill-intentioned speculation, and losses for thousands of people, not only in Argentina. To such an extent that the US Attorney's Office itself began an investigation into this, and not only people close to Milei are mentioned, but it's also very likely that later the US Attorney's Office will summon the president himself, because he also took part in that scam. That was the first scandal, the Libra cryptocurrency scandal. But after that, WhatsApp audio recordings also surfaced, along with confessions from one of his closest associates, casually telling friends that his sister was basically collecting commissions, receiving improper payments, bribes, as we call them in Argentina, of 3% from everyone interested in a meeting with Milei. Therefore, if some businessman or some crypto bro, as they call them, right, one of those cryptocurrency experts, wanted a meeting with Milei for some business deal or some illicit arrangement with the state and his government, well, for that, a 3% commission was required for his sister, who still accompanies him to this day. Not only because of the lack of a political and economic team around this man, but simply because she accompanies him like his nurse, since he suffers from this very distressing personal situation involving psychiatric problems. Well, all that has been said again, his panic attacks, his intestinal incontinence, and well, poor guy, it's pitiful in that sense. But anyway, his sister accompanies him in some way as his support and as his nurse, and of course she accompanies him, but she wants the 3% for any possible deal.
quiere el 3% para cualquier posible negocio. Y esto apareció en los grandes medios, ¿sí?
And this showed up in the major media. Leaks from one of his main collaborators, telling a friend in multiple WhatsApp audios all about this situation. This is the level of... That's how explicit the evidence of this group's corruption is. They themselves recounting the abuses they committed, in their own voices, in their own audios. Well, this is the second to last scandal. Then another scandal came out, because for this election, their main candidate for the legislative elections in Argentina's most important province, the province of Buenos Aires, was actually sponsored from the very beginning of his political career. In fact, an unpresentable, violent, aggressive man, also ultra-neoliberal, ultra-conservative, a disgusting fascist, and on top of that, personally unpleasant as well.
Además, desagradable desde lo personal también. Bueno, pero ¿quién lo patrocinaba? ¿Quién patrocinaba esta Carmelita?
Well, but who was sponsoring him? Who was sponsoring this barefoot Carmelite? None other than a drug trafficker, a major drug trafficker, linked to the Sinaloa cartel, if I remember correctly. Maybe I'm mistaken about the cartel, and it was actually another one. In fact, a man named Fred Machado, a major drug trafficker, was sponsoring him not only with money transfers already documented by the US justice system, which is currently prosecuting this drug trafficker, Fred Machado, but also accompanied him during his political campaign, even on his private jet, his private plane. They traveled around Argentina, around Latin America, with, well, this drug trafficker's money. The complaint was filed some time ago by Juan Graboy, but it was ignored.
La denuncia la realizó Juan Grabois tiempo atrás, no la recogieron. Juan Grabois, con quien nosotros realizamos una charla cuando...
Juan Graboy, with whom we held a talk back in the early days of this channel, when we used to do in-person talks in Berlin. Well, he filed the complaint, and evidence started appearing everywhere. But only when evidence surfaced in the United States. Only when the US justice system conclusively determined the existence of payments from this drug trafficker to Javier Milei's main candidate for these elections, did the Argentine media, corrupt as ever, finally pick up the story, and a scandal with tragicomic overtones began. Because he was being called by the conservative right-wing media, the same ones who had helped Milei, by the way, the ones who had catapulted him to the presidency, and they called him to help this disgraceful narco-politician. And they asked a simple question. Mr. Espert, the name of this candidate, Espert.
El nombre de este candidato, Espert. Bueno, señor Espert, usted recibió...
Well, Mr. Espert, did you receive that money from this drug trafficker or not? And he only had to answer no, lying, of course, but he couldn't say no, because it all seems already proven. So he replied, I'm not going to answer that question. I'm not going to get into Graboy's game. Well, it was a pitiful thing. They asked him the same question 10 times, and all 10 times he couldn't answer. And this caused such a huge scandal for the government that just a few days before the elections, they had to decide to remove, to expel this candidate, Milei's main candidate and strategic ally, from the list of contenders for these elections. So on one hand, there's the economic disaster, and on the other, all these corruption scandals. As a consequence of this unfortunate situation, and of course, we started from the geopolitical level, the big picture, and we're moving step by step toward a closer analysis of tomorrow's elections. Because of all this chaos, every poll predicts a poor result for Milei's government, with even the possibility of a disastrous outcome for his administration. Not many months ago, by the way, Milei's supporters were showing enormous euphoria and excitement. Because according to them, and according to the polls from 6 months ago, all of them predicted a great victory for Milei. Well, now it's exactly the opposite. And we from here are making an even worse prediction than that. Not only are we going to witness an electoral defeat for Milei, but immediately after that, with very high probability, a major economic crisis will begin. A very large one, with a strong, unavoidable devaluation, and also with very high probability, a political crisis and the possibility this, we can't determine with certainty, of course, but still the possibility of the direct fall of his government, right?
De la caída de su gobierno directamente, ¿sí? Podemos cometer un error en nuestra predicción, sin lugar a dudas.
We may make a mistake in our prediction, no doubt about it. We don't have a crystal ball. But remember our predictions about the war in Ukraine, the confrontation between the United States and China, the US elections with Trump, Trump's policies once he came to power, regarding Latin America, and so on and so forth. Yes, lately we're not going to brag, far from it. But all our recent predictions have come true. Well, maybe, in this case, we'll make a mistake. No one is exempt from that. But in our opinion, these elections will mark the end of the Milei experiment, the beginning of a very serious economic crisis, and the possibility of a political crisis and his downfall. Having said all that, what conclusion can we draw from all this? Well, first of all, this should generate hope, without a doubt. It should generate hope that an experiment of this nature, not only terrible from an economic standpoint, not only terrible from a political standpoint, but above all, terrible from a human, social, cultural and civilizational standpoint, an experiment defined by cruelty, by a discourse that promotes cruelty. This idea of, oh, if people with disabilities receive a state subsidy, they shouldn't get it anymore, because they can't compete in the market. So to hell with the disabled. Or, as in another case, the high-complexity children's hospital, the most important in Argentina, also defunded in the name of state budget cuts. No sick children, same thing, to hell with it, in the name of the free market. Well, not to mention Milei's statements during his campaign in favor of organ sales, and even in favor of selling children. Yes, 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 devastating and shocking. Those statements by Milei, never retracted. Later, of course, he didn't harp much on that madness. But within the framework of his ultra-neoliberal ideology, of an ultra-free market and business deals, well, in his mind there seemed to exist the possibility that families, as owners of their children, could, if they wished, sell them to whoever wanted to buy them. This is the narrative of cruelty, of the dehumanization of everything. And the crisis, the destruction, the decline, the fall of this narrative typical of Milei must generate hope. Because indeed Argentine society reacts to this evil, to this dehumanization, to this cruelty, this malice. It reacts with a halt, with enough. Well, that's it. As a society, we will no longer validate more cruelty, more dehumanization. Right next to this lies the positive dimension, without a doubt, of all this. On the other hand, yes, I must point it out, a dimension of concern also appears. A hint of hopelessness also emerges, because despite the crisis of this ultra-neoliberal, dehumanizing, society-destroying experiment, despite that, unfortunately, on our side, the side of humanism, critical thinking, the popular sectors, the popular movement, a transformative, popular project has yet to emerge in response to this. This filth, this rot of Milei, collapses on itself, disappears, capitulates, stages a circus-like fall, but disappears. This is the result of its own collapse, a self-destruction, an implosion, and not the emergence, from our side, from the popular movement, of a transformative project as an alternative to this society of cruelty proposed by Milei. And this, logically, should generate concern and a commitment to building this alternative project. To make matters worse, we are not only witnessing the lack of political and social construction in this regard, but above all, we are witnessing a profound misunderstanding among political leaders, social leaders, opinion makers on our side, from the popular camp, from the field of critical thought, from the field of humanism. We are witnessing a profound misunderstanding of the entire general situation of the world, of Argentina, and of this very government, this very experiment of Milei.
Y de este propio gobierno, de este propio experimento de Milei. Entonces aparecen propuestas o quizás
Then proposals appear, or perhaps even electoral candidacies, slogans. But no one seems to be aware of the fundamental, extremely important meaning of this transformation with which we began the general analysis of the context surrounding the rise and fall of Milei. This transformation, this shift from a unipolar order to a multipolar one, this end of US hegemony and the end of Western hegemony, this crisis in the cycle of capitalist accumulation led by the United States, is at the same time an opportunity for a new kind of integration, not only for Argentina, but for the entire Latin American region, into this new world, this new order. This stands light years away from the way political leaders, social leaders, economic leaders, and opinion makers see things. Even journalists and analysts on our side, on the side of the popular movement. We find ourselves in a unique historical moment, marked by crisis, no doubt, but also by opportunity. Before us lies a turning point, a watershed moment in which only the lucid, those capable of strategic thinking, will be able to emerge in that new world, to arrive in that new world from a privileged position. And in this sense, in Argentina in particular, much more than in Brazil, much more than in Mexico. Well, not much more than in Europe, because there too people seem completely lost. But in Argentina, we appear much more disoriented and much less aware of this than many of our brothers, such as the Mexicans or the Brazilians, with Claudia Sheinbaum and Lula da Silva. So there remains an unresolved issue, a concern in the face, once again, of that dimension of hope amid the collapse, the downfall of this project of cruelty led by Milei. As an example, to demonstrate this lack of interest in geopolitical issues and all that, I won't mention anyone in particular or any specific outlet, but since I arrived here in Buenos Aires, I've offered several media outlets, from the popular field, the possibility of having discussions, expressing my full willingness to contribute in any way from this position. Perhaps a different one from the day-to-day news coverage these outlets usually do. And they didn't reject the proposals, not at all, but they all lack interest. What? Geopolitics? What? The rise of China, Russia, India? What? The crisis of the United States, of neoliberalism, of Western hegemony? What? No, none of that. We just cover daily news here. Also, surely there's a bit of our local Buenos Aires attitude of, oh no, we already know everything. Why do we need a perspective from someone with a slightly broader view? But anyway, no, I'm not here grumbling about the lack of interest, but simply pointing out the fact that we're missing that slightly bigger perspective. Necessary, essential for any political project from our place, from the popular front, from the forces that stand with those at the bottom, the everyday people, the communities, you and me, the ones who break through, to be aware of all these transformations, which are also essential for any collective endeavor. Now then, may I use this space to issue a warning? The United Provinces Party is an attempt to secure congressional seats that serve Milei, that serve the United States. You can confirm this by visiting the website of the NGO Political Action Network, RAP, which is funded by the NGO NED, where you'll find the Argentine politicians financed by the United States. Well, thank you very much, Pesci. This is really good, really good. Pesci 77 with, well, the NE funders of Argentine parties. As always, La Libertad Avanza, Milei's party, is also sponsored by the NED, by US organizations, well, organizations directly linked to the Republican Party, not to mention the Zionist ones. Naturally as well, right? Obviously. Powerful people. Really powerful. Yesterday, by the way, we held an amazing talk with our friend Jesus López Almejo, your IR professor, from the channel, Tu Profe de RI. A lot of people joined us, but even more should have. Maybe our entire European audience couldn't make it, because of the time difference.
toda nuestra audiencia de Europa no pudo por el horario, debido a la diferencia horaria, realizamos la charla.
Because of the time difference, we held the talk at midnight, or 0 European time. Don't miss it. Don't miss it. Because together with Jesus, we went over all the major topics: Latin America, the United States, Europe, Ukraine, the Middle East, Israel. The talk is available for anyone who couldn't watch it live. And in just a bit, by the way, Juan Antonio Aguilar's program begins. So shortly, there will also be analysis from another of, in my opinion, the best geopolitical analysts. Well, all the analysts from DMP Geopolitica, all of them, are already top tier. Fernando Moragon, Juan Antonio Aguilar, Adrian Zelaya, Javier Martinez, Santiago Martinez, Eduardo Bior, Bruno Sgarcini. All of them, in my humble opinion, represent the creme de la creme, the best of geopolitical analysis in Spanish, at least a good part of it. So don't miss their programs on our DMP channel, also broadcast here on Demolishing Myths.
En nuestro canal de MP y con retransmisión aquí en Demoliendo Mitos de la Política. Acompañen también a nuestro canal hermano en Telegram, Guerras y...
Also, follow our sister channel on Telegram, Wars and Geopolitics. And well, if you want to support our English channel, Demolishing Political Myths, basically the same as this one, translated into English with artificial intelligence, you can help us there. For now, share, subscribe, like, and well, that's it. Happy Saturday to everyone. And tomorrow, in Argentina's case, everyone go vote to give that disgraceful Milei a kick in the ass as soon as possible. Tomorrow we'll be with Fernando Moragon. Until then, a kiss and a hug. We love you all and have a great Saturday. Bye.
Queremos mucho y buen sábado. Chao.